The sun was low, and the sky was red with smoke. The land shook with the roar of heavy fire and broken steel. Men and women rushed through the ruins while cries of pain filled the air. Soldiers tried to hold the line, but the enemy pushed harder. The convoy that carried the weak and the young was struck in the chaos. Fear and confusion broke what little order remained. A boy named Ethan ran through the wreckage. His small feet stumbled on the broken ground. He called for his mother, but the sound of fire drowned his voice. He was lost between the falling walls and burning carts. No one heard him. No one looked back. He was alone until a shadow fell across him. Jack, a soldier with a rifle in one hand and blood on his arm, saw the boy. He saw the strike coming. Without thought, he threw himself over Ethan, still cut into his shoulder as he shielded the child. The pain burned, but Jack did not cry out. He held Ethan close and pulled him away from the blast. Dust and fire closed around them, but they still stood. Ethan looked up at Jack with wide eyes. He could not speak. His small hands gripped the soldier's torn uniform. Jack looked down and saw fear in the boy's face. He bent low and said in a rough voice that he would not let go. The boy clung tighter. Far away, Claire, Ethan's mother, saw the strike that nearly took her son. She saw Jack fall over him. She screamed his name as she cut through the press of bodies. Her sword was red and her face hard with rage. She would not let her son be taken. She ran, but the distance between them grew as the fight closed in. The line of soldiers broke again. The enemy poured through. Fire cut across the ground. Men cried out as they fell. In the smoke and ruin, Jack carried Ethan in his arms. His wound slowed him, but he did not stop. Other soldiers shouted at him to leave the boy. They told him he would die if he carried weight. Jack did not answer. He set his jaw and pushed forward. Ethan buried his face in Jack's chest. He was silent, but his small body shook. Jack could feel the boy's fear, but it gave him strength. He moved through the ruins with fire at his back and steel at his side. He had faced death before, but never with a child in his arms. This fight was different. This fight he could not lose. Claire fought like a storm. She cut through the men who blocked her path. Her voice carried above the noise as she shouted her son's name. Some soldiers followed her cry. They struck harder and held longer. But still the gap between her and Ethan remained wide. The enemy pressed between them. She saw Jack, but she could not reach him. Rage burned in her chest. Jack reached the edge of the ruins. His breath came heavy, and his wound bled more with each step. He looked down at Ethan and tightened his hold. He thought of the men he had lost. He thought of his own mother, long dead. He thought of the promise he had just made to this child. He would not fail. Behind him, the ground shook. Fire tore through what remained of the convoy. Claire's scream cut through the sky. Jack turned and saw her fighting. Her eyes locked on him and the boy. She saw his wound. She saw his strength. She did not see fear. She saw a man who stood when others would fall. Ethan lifted his head and saw his mother. His small voice called her name. Claire heard and struck harder. The distance began to close. Soldiers rallied around her. They fought toward Jack and the boy. Each step was bought with blood, but they did not stop. The sound of steel and fire filled the air. Jack set Ethan on his feet for a moment and raised his rifle with his good arm. He fired into the press of men who rushed at them. Each shot was slow, but each one struck. He would hold until Claire reached them. He would hold until he could place the boy back in her arms. The sky was black with smoke, and the ground was red with fire. In the center of it, a soldier and a child stood together. The soldier bled but did not fall. The child trembled but did not run. Far away, the mother fought with a fury that no wall could break. The battle roared, but one truth burned brighter. A man had taken the strike for a boy, and a mother would answer with fire. The night grew darker as fire spread across the broken land. Smoke rose high and carried the stench of blood. Kept moving with Ethan in his arms. His wounds slowed him, but he refused to fall. Every step felt heavier, yet his will pushed him forward. Ethan held on tight with his face pressed into Jack's chest. The boy did not cry, but his silence cut deeper than any wound. Soldiers passed Jack and shouted for him to drop the child. They told him the enemy would hunt him first if they saw he carried the boy. Jack ignored them, gritted his teeth and pushed through the smoke. He would not leave the boy, would not allow harm to reach him. his heart had already chosen. Behind him, Claire fought with burning rage. Her sword flashed in the dark. Her voice rose above the clash of steel as she called her son's name. Each time Ethan heard her, he lifted his head and looked for her face. Jack whispered for him to hold on, that she would reach them. But the lines of men pressed hard, and the gap between them remained wide. Jack reached a wall of stone, half broken by fire. He set Ethan down for a moment and leaned against the wall to steady himself. His arm throbbed with pain where the strike had cut him. Blood soaked his sleeve and dripped to the ground. He forced himself to breathe steady. Ethan tugged his arm and whispered for him not to die. Jack knelt, looked the boy in the eyes, and told him that he was not going to fall. He made a vow with no weakness in his voice. The enemy surged closer. Jack pulled Ethan behind the wall and raised his rifle again. Each shot he fired pushed the enemy back for a moment, but never for long. His strength began to fade. He knew he could not hold alone for much longer. Yet he did not stop. Each time he looked at Ethan, he felt fire in his chest that pushed his body past the pain. Claire's rage cut a path through the swarm. She drove her blade with the force of a storm. Soldiers around her drew courage from her cry and fought harder. She moved like a shield of iron, pressing forward step by step. Every strike she made brought her closer to her son. Her heart burned with fear and fury, but her hand never shook. Jack pulled Ethan close again and forced himself forward from the wall. He staggered, but did not fall. The boy's small arms circled his neck. Jack could feel the weight of the child and the hope carried in him. That hope was worth more than his own life. He told himself that no blade would touch Ethan, while he still drew breath. The ground shook with another blast. Stone and fire rained down. Jack covered Ethan with his own body once more. The flames passed over them, but the soldier did not move aside. When the roar ended, he rose again, coughing smoke. His body ached, but he tightened his grip and kept moving. The distance, Claire broke through at last. She saw Jack and Ethan in the firelight. Relief and rage mixed on her face. She shouted their names and charged with all her strength. Jack saw her form through the haze and felt strength return to his legs. He called her name back, his voice rough but strong. Ethan lifted his head and reached toward her with a cry. The enemy saw them too. A squad broke from the main fight and rushed to cut them off. Jack turned his body to shield Ethan and raised his rifle. Fired until the clip was empty. When no bullets remained, he drew his knife. His body shook, but he stood firm in front of the boy. The men rushed at him with steel raised. Jack planted his feet and roared like a beast. Before they reached him, Claire struck from the side. She cut them down with savage fury. Her blade flashed red in the firelight. Jack lowered his knife as she came to him. She reached her son and pulled him into her arms. Tears burned in her eyes, but her voice was strong as she told him she had come. Ethan buried his face against her and clung tight. Jack dropped to one knee, his breath ragged. Claire looked at him and saw the wound he carried. Her heart filled with fierce respect. She placed her hand on his shoulder and promised that he would not fall alone. Around them, soldiers rallied at the sight of mother and child saved. The fight was not over, but the will of the humans burned brighter than the fire around them. The fire still raged across the ruins as the night deepened. Smoke covered the stars and the ground shook with heavy steps. Jack stood with his knife in hand, his body weak but his eyes hard. Claire held Ethan close to her chest, her sword dripping red. Around them the soldiers tried to regroup, but the enemy pressed stronger with each wave. The clash of steel and the roar of fire filled the broken land. Jack forced himself back to his feet. His wound burned, but he would not rest while Claire and Ethan were still in danger. Claire looked at him and gave a short nod. They had no words, but both knew the fight was far from over. The enemy moved toward them in great numbers, their blades flashing in the firelight. The humans braced themselves for the next storm. The first line of soldiers charged. Jack pushed himself to the front with his rifle reloaded. His shots cut through the night, each strike buying a moment more. When they came close, he switched to his knife and fought with raw will. Claire stood at his side, her sword carving through the wave that crashed against them. They moved as if bound by the same fire. Back to back they fought, each protecting the other without thought. Ethan watched with wide eyes. He stood behind the line of men, his small hands clutching the torn cloth of his mother's cloak. The boy saw his mother strike, and his protector bleed, yet stand firm. His heart filled with pride and fear, but more than that, it filled with courage. He picked up a stone from the ground and gripped it tight, ready to defend if anyone broke through. The battle roared louder. More soldiers joined Jack and Claire, drawn by their defiance. Men who had lost hope found new strength when they saw the pair standing together. They shouted as they struck, their voices echoing across the field. The enemy pressed hard, but the humans refused to give ground. The line bent but did not break. Jack fought with teeth clenched, each move slower than before. His arm throbbed and blood still dripped from his wound. Yet every time he thought his strength would fail, he looked back and saw Ethan's face. That sight pushed him forward. He struck harder, his knife flashing in the firelight. He fought not for orders, not for glory, but for the boy who clung to hope. Claire's fury only grew. She cut through foes with savage force, her eyes fixed on those who dared move toward her child. Her blade never slowed, her body never faltered. Soldiers whispered her name as they fought near her. Some called her Queen of the Battlefield, a title born not of crown but of fire and blood. Her presence alone turned fear into strength. The enemy tried to break them with a heavy charge. The ground shook as their strongest fighters came forward. Jack braced himself, but his legs trembled. Claire shouted for the men to hold. She raised her sword high and called that no child would fall this night. Her cry cut through the chaos and lit fire in every human heart. They raised their weapons and roared back, their voices like thunder. The clash was brutal. Steel cut flesh and fire burned all around. Jack's blade struck again and again, though his hands shook with pain. Claire fought like a storm, cutting a path through the strongest of foes. Ethan stayed low, but his small voice shouted for them to fight. He threw stones at those who drew too near. His courage made men around him grit their teeth and push harder. Blood stained the ground and bodies fell in heaps. Yet still, Jack stood. Still Claire struck. Still Ethan held his stone with fierce eyes. The enemy began to falter, stunned by the fury that burned in the humans. They had thought the soldiers weak. They had thought the child would break them. Instead, the child gave them strength beyond reason. When the charge finally broke and the enemy pulled back for breath, the humans stood together. Jack leaned on his rifle, gasping but still on his feet. Claire stood tall with her son behind her, her sword steady in her hand. The soldiers around them lifted their weapons high and shouted in triumph. The line had held when it should have fallen. The fight was not over, but the spirit of humans burned brighter than fire. That night, the enemy learned that no force could break the will of a soldier, a mother, and a child bound by courage. The air was thick with smoke and the ground was slick with blood. Jack wiped his face with his sleeve and kept his rifle close. Claire stood beside him with her sword ready, her eyes burning. Ethan stayed close behind, his hands still clutching the stone he refused to drop. The humans had held the line for now, but they all knew another wave would come. The enemy would not stop until every defender was broken. Jack's breath came rough, and his wound throbbed with each heartbeat. He felt weakness press in on him, but he pushed it aside. He knew that if he fell, Ethan would be left with no shield. He looked at Claire and their eyes met. No words passed, yet both knew they had to stand until the end. Around them the soldiers shifted, their faces pale but their weapons steady. Fear and fire lived side by side in every man and woman there. The enemy horn sounded again. From the smoke came their strongest fighters, armored and carrying heavy blades. The ground shook beneath their steps. The humans tightened their line. Some whispered prayers, others gripped their weapons until their hands bled. Claire raised her sword high and called out that no mother would lose her child this night. Her voice was fierce and sharp, cutting across the noise. The soldiers roared back with a sound that carried through the dark. The enemy charged. Jack fired his rifle until the clip emptied, each shot striking true. When the foe closed in, he drew his knife again. His body ached, his wound burned, but his spirit did not falter. He fought like a man who had nothing left to lose. Beside him, Claire cut through the wave with savage strikes. Her blade flashed with every movement, each swing backed by a mother's wrath. She struck down anyone who dared move toward her son. Ethan crouched low behind them, A small voice shouted each time the soldiers pushed forward. He held his stone tight, ready to strike if anyone broke through. His courage gave strength to those near him. Hardened men who had thought themselves lost now fought harder, inspired by the sight of a boy who would not flee. The clash was brutal. Steel rang on steel, screams filled the night, and blood stained the earth. The enemy pressed with force meant to crush, but the humans stood firm. Jack felt his knees weaken, yet every time he thought he might fall, he remembered the boy behind him. He drove his knife forward again and again, each strike fueled by will alone. His body was broken, but his spirit refused to surrender. Claire's fury grew with each passing moment. Her arms ached, but her strikes never slowed. She shouted to the soldiers to hold the line, to fight for the children, to fight for the land that was theirs. Her voice carried over the chaos, lifting hearts that had nearly fallen. Ash! Men and women roared back, their blades striking harder. Together they formed a wall that would not yield. The enemy leader came forward, taller and stronger than the rest. His blade cut down men in a single swing. He pressed straight toward Jack and Claire, hoping to break the heart of the line. Jack stepped forward, though his body shook. He raised his knife and set his feet. Claire moved beside him, sword ready, her eyes fixed on the giant before them. Ethan cried out in fear, but also in defiance, his small voice rising above the roar. The clash shook the ground. Jack dodged the heavy swing and struck with his knife, cutting deep into the side of the giant. Claire followed with a strike that rang like thunder. The foe staggered, but did not fall. Again they struck. Again they drove him back. The soldiers around them shouted as they saw the giant falter. Hope spread through their ranks like fire. With a final cry, Claire drove her blade through his chest. The giant fell to the ground with a heavy crash. Silence fell for a heartbeat, then the humans roared in triumph. The enemy line wavered, stunned by the fall of their strongest. Jack dropped to one knee, gasping for air, his knife slick with blood. Claire stood tall with her sword raised high. Ethan rushed to her side, clutching her arm. The soldiers lifted their weapons and shouted as one. The enemy pulled back into the smoke, broken for now. The humans stood, bloodied, but unbowed. Jack leaned on his rifle and looked at Claire and Ethan. In that moment, he knew the fight was far from over, but he also knew they would not fall. A soldier, a mother, and a child had turned despair into fire. Their stand would be remembered, for no force could crush the will of those who fought with love and fury. The night was long, and the battlefield was covered with smoke and ash. The smell of blood and fire filled the air. Jack leaned on his rifle, his wound still bleeding but his spirit unbroken. Claire stood with her sword in hand, her face hard with rage and resolve. Ethan held onto his mother's cloak, his small hands stained with dirt, his eyes wide but fearless. Around them, the soldiers stood ready, though tired and worn. They all knew the fight was not finished. The enemy regrouped in the distance. Their horns sounded low and cruel. The humans braced themselves. Jack lifted his rifle again, though his arm trembled. Claire raised her sword high and told the men that no one would break them, not while a mother still drew breath, and not while a soldier still stood. Her voice gave fire to their hearts. They roared back and tightened the line. The ground shook as the enemy surged forward once more. Their blades gleamed, and their steps thundered. Jack fired into their front, each shot cutting down a foe. When his rifle emptied, he drew his knife and stood firm. Claire's sword swung with fury, each strike throwing back those who dared to close in. The soldiers around them struck with renewed strength. They fought as if their lives had no worth except to protect the child behind them. Ethan crouched low, but he did not hide. His voice rose with every cry of the men. He shouted for them to hold. He threw stones at the ones who came near. His courage was small in size but great in weight. The men who saw him found themselves unable to break. They pressed harder, unwilling to let fear touch the boy. The clash was savage. Men fell, blood poured, and steel rang through the night. Jack's body swayed, but he refused to fall. Each time he thought his legs would fail, he felt Ethan's eyes on him. That gaze filled him with strength. He drove his knife into foes with grim force. Pain tore through him, but he pushed it aside. His heart beat only with one vow, to guard the boy until breath left him. Claire's wrath grew into a storm. She fought like fire given form. Her sword split through armor and bone. She shouted to the soldiers to strike harder, to remember the children and the families that waited behind them. Her cry reached every ear. Men who thought they were finished found strength again. They lifted their weapons and roared as they pushed the enemy back. The enemy answered with their fiercest warriors. They struck like hammers, breaking the ground and cutting down men with ease. Fear spread through the ranks for a moment, but Claire's voice rose again. She declared that none who touched a child would leave the field alive. Her words were not just sound, they were a command. Soldiers gritted their teeth and struck back with savage force. Jack faced one of the fierce warriors alone. The man's blade crashed against his knife and sent sparks into the night. Jack staggered but did not fall. He blocked another strike, his arm shaking under the weight. With a roar, he drove his knife into the man's throat. Blood poured, and the foe fell. Jack gasped for air, his body near breaking, but his spirit only burned brighter. Claire cut through another wave and reached Jack's side. For a moment they stood together, shoulder to shoulder, their weapons raised. Ethan looked at them both, his small chest heaving with pride. He shouted for them to fight, his voice sharp and fearless. The soldiers around him echoed his cry. The sound filled the air like thunder. The enemy charge slowed. They had thrown their strongest, and still the humans stood. Fear spread among them. Some began to step back. The humans saw it and struck harder. Jack roared as he drove forward. Claire at his side, soldiers pressing with them. Steel and fire cut through the night until the enemy line broke apart. Silence followed for a moment, broken only by ragged breath. The humans had held once more. Jack sank to one knee, his knife heavy in his hand. Claire stood tall, her son pressed against her side. Soldiers lifted their weapons and shouted in triumph. They were bloodied, but alive. The enemy had learned again that no force could break a soldier's courage, a mother's fury, and a child's will. The battle was not yet over, but the fire of humans blazed higher than the flames that burned the land. The battlefield was quiet for only a short breath before the horn sounded again. The enemy was gathering for another strike. The humans stood in the ruins, tired and wounded, but their hearts still burned. Jack leaned heavy on his rifle, his shoulder bleeding without end, yet his eyes stayed sharp. Claire stood with her sword raised, her son Ethan pressed close against her side. The soldiers around them tightened their grips on their weapons. They all knew the night had not ended. Jack wiped the blood from his brow and stepped forward to the front of the line. His body shook, but his will held steady. He looked at Claire and nodded once. She gave a firm nod back, her hand gripping the hilt of her sword, as if it was the only thing keeping her upright. Behind them, Ethan's eyes followed every move. He was just a boy, yet in his heart there was no fear left, only fire. The enemy roared as they came from the smoke. Their numbers filled the ruins, blades and shields flashing in the red glow of fire. The ground shook as their heavy steps grew louder. The humans braced for the storm. Jack lifted his rifle and fired until the clip was empty. His shots cut into the wave, but still they came. He threw the rifle aside and drew his knife, his teeth clenched in rage. Claire lifted her sword and shouted for the men to hold. Her cry struck every ear and lit sparks in weary hearts. The clash began once more. Steel smashed against steel. The air filled with the screams of men and the roar of fire. Jack fought with his knife, each strike heavy and full of fury. His body was near the edge, but he refused to fall. Claire struck down foe after foe, her blade a streak of light in the smoke. She did not tire, she did not falter. Every strike she made was a promise that her son would not be touched. Ethan crouched low, but his voice rose again, shouted for them to fight, his small cries cutting through the thunder of war. He threw stones with all his strength, each one flying true. Soldiers saw him and found new courage. Hardened men felt their legs steady again when they heard his voice. The boy had become more than a child. He was a spark that kept the fire alive. The enemy pressed with all their weight. Their strongest broke through the first line and struck at the humans with brutal force. Men were thrown aside, bodies fell in heaps, but still the line held. Jack faced one of the strongest and locked blades with him. His arm shook, his knife trembled, but he would not break. He pushed forward with a roar and drove his blade deep into the man's chest. He staggered back, his breath ragged. but still he stood. Claire cut her way toward Jack, striking down any who came near. She reached his side just as more enemies closed in. Together, they fought as one. She struck with her sword, he with his knife, their movements sharp and fierce. Back to back they held the ground. Blood poured from their wounds, yet their eyes never wavered. The soldiers around them shouted and fought harder. They followed the example of the mother and the soldier. They refused to retreat. Each man and woman knew that if they gave way, the boy behind them would fall. That thought filled them with a fury greater than pain or fear. They struck with the strength of the desperate, and the enemy began to falter. The fight grew savage. The ground was slick, the smoke thick, the night endless. Jack felt his strength fading, but when he looked at Ethan, he felt fire again. Claire's face was pale with exhaustion, yet her strikes never slowed. Together, they formed the heart of the defense. Around them, the humans stood like stone. Last, the enemy line wavered. They had thrown all their weight into the attack, and still the humans held. The giants they trusted to break the line lay dead. Fear spread through their ranks. They began to pull back, their horns calling retreat. The humans did not chase. They stood in silence, their weapons dripping, their bodies shaking, but their spirit fierce. Jack dropped to one knee, gasping for air. Claire stood tall, though her body trembled, her hand on Ethan's shoulder. The boy looked at both of them with wide eyes filled with pride. The soldiers raised their weapons high and shouted together. They had stood when no one thought they could. The night was not done, but the fire of the humans had burned through the storm once again. The sky was pale with the first light of dawn. Smoke still hung over the ruins, and the ground was black with ash and blood. The enemy had fallen back into the distance, broken and scattered. The field was silent but for the cries of the wounded and the heavy breath of those who still stood. Jack knelt on the ground, his hand pressed to his bleeding shoulder, his body near collapse. Yet his eyes were steady, watching the boy and the mother he had sworn to protect. Claire stood tall, though her body trembled. Her sword was heavy, but still in her grip. Ethan clung to her side, his small face smeared with dirt and blood, but his spirit unshaken. Around them, soldiers moved slowly, helping the wounded, raising the fallen, and steadying those who could not walk. The field was littered with broken steel and shattered shields, but the humans had not fallen. Jack tried to rise, but his legs gave way. Claire rushed to his side and caught him before he fell. Her eyes burned with respect as she looked at the soldier who had thrown himself over her son. She told him that he would not fall alone. Her voice was firm and sharp, carrying to the soldiers nearby. They heard her words and raised their weapons high. They shouted that no man who shields a child shall ever be left behind. The cry spread through the ranks like fire. Men and women lifted their blades and roared to the sky. The sound echoed across the field and carried far beyond the smoke. The vow of a mother had become the vow of all. Jack, bleeding and broken, heard the cry and felt strength return to him. He forced himself to stand, his knife still in his hand, and raised it high in answer. Ethan looked at him with wide eyes. The boy stepped forward, small and unsteady, and placed his hand on Jack's arm. He called him brother in a voice that shook, but did not falter. Jack looked down at him and nodded once. It was a bond forged in fire, stronger than steel. Claire held her son close, and her eyes shone with fierce pride. The soldiers gathered around them. Some bled, some limped, some could barely stand, but all raised their weapons. They had fought through the night and stood at dawn. They had seen death and still chosen to rise. They looked to Claire, to Jack, to the boy who had given them courage, and they knew their fight was not only for land, but for the promise that no child would be left unprotected. The enemy did not return. Their spirit was broken. They had seen the fury of a mother and the defiance of a soldier. They had seen a child stand unafraid in the heart of battle. No victory could be won against such fire. They had learned fear, and fear would keep them away. Claire raised her sword one last time. Her voice rang across the field as she declared that the fight was not only won, but remembered. She told the men and women that their stand would live in the hearts of every family, that their courage would be sung by children yet to come. Her words struck every soul and filled them with pride. Jack lowered his knife at last. His body could hold no longer, and he fell to one knee. Soldiers rushed to steady him.
Ow.
Claire placed her hand on his shoulder and swore again that he would not stand alone. Ethan wrapped his arms around his neck and would not let go. In that moment, all who watched felt the truth of their bond. The dawn rose higher. Light touched the battlefield and revealed the faces of those who had stood through the storm. They were scarred, they were bloodied, but their eyes held fire. They had faced the night and broken the weight of fear. No horn, no blade, no storm had crushed them. Their spirits stood like stone. That day became legend. It was told of the soldier who took the strike for a child, and the mother who answered with fire, and the boy whose courage lit the hearts of many. It was said that no force could break them, for their vow was bound in blood and love. And it was remembered that when dawn came, the cry of humans shook the world.